"You're not my type," she said, without even looking up from her phone, and somehow, that hurt more than if she had laughed. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, cutting through the low hum of the upscale Manhattan restaurant where Daniel stood frozen for half a second, his hands still hovering awkwardly near the back of the empty chair he had been about to offer her. Around them, glasses clinked, a waiter passed by with a tray of wine, and life kept moving like nothing had just happened, but inside him, something quietly shifted as he forced a small, polite smile and nodded like it didn't matter. Even though it did, more than he wanted to admit, because it wasn't just rejection, it was how easily she said it, like she had already measured him and found him lacking within seconds of meeting him. Ava Carter, CEO of a fast-growing tech company that had been all over Forbes for the past year, finally glanced up, her expression calm, unreadable, almost bored, as if this conversation was already over before it had begun. She adjusted the sleeve of her tailored blazer, the kind that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, and took a sip of sparkling water, her posture straight, composed, untouchable. Daniel cleared his throat, pulling the chair back anyway, not for her, but to sit down himself, because walking away now would feel like admitting defeat, and he wasn't sure why that mattered so much when he barely knew her, but it did. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the fact that this meeting had taken him 3 weeks to secure through a mutual contact who swore Ava respected people who showed up, and now here he was, showing up, only to be dismissed in under 30 seconds. "That's fair," he said quietly, folding his hands on the table, trying to keep his voice steady, while inside his chest something tightened, not anger exactly, but something closer to disappointment mixed with stubborn curiosity, because people didn't usually say things like that out loud unless they truly didn't care what others thought, and that alone made him wonder who she really was beyond the headlines and sharp edges. Ava tilted her head slightly, studying him now as if reassessing whether he would react like everyone else, defensive, offended, eager to prove himself, but Daniel didn't do any of that, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, brief but noticeable, before she set her glass down with a soft click and said, "So why are you still sitting here?" It wasn't hostile, just direct, almost clinical, like a test, and Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing toward the window where the city lights reflected against the glass, then back at her, choosing his next words carefully because suddenly, this felt like more than just a failed meeting. It felt like a moment that could either end here or turn into something unexpected, even if he had no idea what that something was yet. And as a waiter approached to ask if they were ready to order, Ava didn't answer, her gaze still fixed on Daniel, waiting, while the question lingered between them, heavier now, as if his answer might change more than just the outcome of this dinner. "Because I'm not here to be your type," Daniel said, before he could second-guess himself, and the moment the words left his mouth, even he felt the shift in the air as the waiter paused mid-motion, glancing between them, unsure whether to stay or step back. Ava didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in offense but in calculation, like she was trying to place him into a category that suddenly didn't fit as neatly as before, and after a second that stretched longer than it should have, she gave a small nod to the waiter and said, "Black coffee," her tone calm again, controlled, as if nothing had changed, yet something clearly had, because she didn't dismiss Daniel this time, didn't look back at her phone, didn't signal that the meeting was over, and that alone told him he had crossed some invisible threshold. Daniel ordered the cheapest thing on the menu without looking, more out of habit than hunger, and when the waiter left, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore, it was charged, uncertain, like both of them were waiting to see who would define it first. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, her gaze steady on him as she asked, "Then why are you here?" And this time, it sounded less like a challenge and more like genuine curiosity, though she tried to hide it under that same composed exterior. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table, grounding himself, because the truth felt strangely heavier than expected, and he wasn't used to saying it out loud, especially not to someone like her, but something about the way she watched him, sharp, unfiltered, made it harder to hide behind anything superficial. "I needed this meeting," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more honest, and Ava's expression didn't change, but she didn't interrupt either, which felt like permission to continue. "Not just for business," he added after a brief pause, glancing down before meeting her eyes again, "but because everyone keeps saying you don't make time for people unless they matter, and I wanted to see if that was true. That earned the smallest reaction, a subtle lift of her eyebrow, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and Daniel felt it like a signal that he hadn't completely misread her. Outside, a car horn blared briefly, snapping the moment just enough for Ava to shift forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table as she studied him again, this time more intently, as if peeling back a layer she hadn't bothered to look at before. "And," she asked, her voice softer now, though still controlled, "do you matter?" It wasn't mocking, but it wasn't kind either, it was honest, direct, and somehow more dangerous because of it. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, not out of confidence but something closer to acceptance. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head slightly, "but I showed up anyway." For a brief second, something flickered across Ava's face again, faster this time, almost gone before it could be named, and she leaned back once more, tapping her fingers lightly against the table, as if weighing a decision she hadn't planned to make tonight, and just as the waiter returned with their drinks, setting them down carefully between them, Ava reached for her coffee but didn't drink it, her eyes still on Daniel as she said, almost to herself, "That's inconvenient," and the way she said it carried a quiet tension that hadn't been there before, like something inside her had just been disrupted in a way she wasn't used to, and Daniel realized, sitting across from her in that moment, that whatever this was, it wasn't over, not even close. "Inconvenient how?" Daniel asked, before he could stop himself, and the question lingered just long enough to make Ava finally break eye contact, her fingers tightening slightly around the warm ceramic cup as if grounding herself in something familiar, something predictable, which this conversation clearly wasn't anymore. She let out a quiet breath through her nose, almost like she was recalibrating, then took a small sip of her coffee before answering. "Because I don't usually change my mind mid-conversation," her tone steady again, but there was a subtle shift underneath it now, less certainty, more awareness, and Daniel caught it, not fully understanding what it meant yet, but enough to feel that the balance between them had tilted, even if only slightly. A sudden burst of laughter came from a nearby table, pulling both of their attention for a split second, and when Ava looked back at him, her expression had softened just a fraction, not warmth exactly, but something less guarded, as if she had decided, consciously or not, to stay in this moment instead of shutting it down like she probably would have with anyone else. "So what do you actually want from me?" she asked, this time without the edge, and Daniel hesitated, because the honest answer felt riskier now than before, not because of rejection, but because something about her attention made it matter more than it should. He leaned back slightly, running a hand through his hair, glancing briefly toward the window again as if buying himself time, but the truth didn't change no matter how long he delayed it. "A chance," he said finally, his voice low but clear, and Ava's eyes flickered again, sharper this time, like she hadn't expected something so simple, or maybe something so direct. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a name that clearly meant something because her posture straightened instantly, the softness disappearing as quickly as it had come. She glanced at it, hesitated for half a second, then picked it up, her voice shifting back into that controlled, executive tone as she answered, "I told you I'd review it in the morning," her words precise, clipped, and for the next 30 seconds, she wasn't the woman sitting across from Daniel anymore. She was the CEO everyone talked about, decisive, distant, efficient, solving problems in real time without room for hesitation. Daniel watched quietly, noticing how naturally she slipped into that version of herself, and more importantly, how quickly she built that wall back up, like whatever had almost opened between them just now needed to be contained, managed, controlled. When she ended the call, she didn't immediately look at him again, instead setting her phone down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if restoring order, but the silence that followed felt different now, not tense, but fragile, like something unspoken had just been interrupted and might not come back the same way. "You should take opportunities when they're offered," she said after a moment, her gaze still not fully meeting his, and Daniel frowned slightly, unsure if she was talking about him or herself, and that uncertainty sat between them, growing heavier as the seconds passed, until Ava finally looked up again, her eyes sharper now but carrying something else underneath, something harder to ignore this time, as she added, "But you should also know when something isn't meant to last," and the way she said it didn't sound like advice, it sounded like experience, like a rule she had learned the hard way, and for the first time since sitting down, Daniel felt a quiet unease settle in his chest, not because of what she said, but because of how much it felt like a warning. That sounds like something you tell yourself so you don't have to risk anything, Daniel said quietly, and the moment he said it, he could feel the line he had just crossed, subtle but irreversible, as Ava's eyes locked onto his with a sharpness that hadn't been there before, not anger exactly, but recognition, like he had touched something she didn't expect him to see. The restaurant noise seemed to fade for a second as she straightened in her chair, her fingers still resting near her untouched coffee, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but tighter now, more deliberate. "You don't know anything about what I risk," she replied, and Daniel nodded slightly, accepting that, but not backing down, because something about her earlier words had stayed with him, the way they didn't sound like theory but like something lived, something repeated enough times to become a rule. "You're right," he said, his tone steady, "but people don't build rules like that unless something made them." That landed differently, heavier, and Ava didn't respond right away, her gaze shifting past him for a brief moment, not avoiding, but searching, as if deciding whether this conversation was still worth continuing or if it had gone too far beyond what she allowed in her carefully controlled world. A server passed by, nearly brushing against Daniel's chair, apologizing quickly, and the interruption broke the tension just enough for Ava to lean back again, crossing her arms this time, a more defensive posture than before, but her eyes remained on him, studying, reassessing. "You're persistent," she said, almost flat, but there was something else beneath it now, something closer to curiosity than dismissal, and Daniel let out a small breath, a hint of a smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Only when something feels unfinished," he answered, and that word, unfinished, seemed to hang between them in a way neither of them expected, because suddenly, this wasn't just about a meeting anymore, or even about first impressions, it felt like two people standing at the edge of something undefined, both aware of it, neither willing to name it yet. Ava uncrossed her arms slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the table as if grounding herself again, and for the first time, there was a crack in the certainty she had carried since the moment he sat down, small but undeniable, as she asked, more quietly now, "And what makes you think this isn't already finished?" It wasn't a challenge this time, it was a question, real and unguarded in a way that didn't match the version of her Daniel had heard about, and he felt it shift something inside him too, making this moment feel less like a pitch and more like something personal, something fragile. Before he could answer, a sudden movement caught both of their attention as a woman near the entrance stood up abruptly, her voice raised just enough to turn heads, arguing with someone over the phone, her frustration spilling into the room, and for a brief second, Ava watched her with an expression that wasn't judgmental, but distant, almost reflective, like she recognized something in that scene, something she had been careful not to become. When she looked back at Daniel, her expression had changed again, softer, but also more conflicted, as if whatever wall she had built was no longer as solid as it had been an hour ago. "I don't do unfinished things," she said, but this time, it didn't sound like confidence, it sounded like a rule she was trying to hold on to, even as it started to slip, and Daniel realized then that whatever had shifted tonight wasn't just his position in this conversation, it was hers too, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet, and that realization came with a quiet tension, because if she was starting to question her own rules, then this wasn't just a conversation anymore, it was the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. "Then maybe this is the first time," Daniel said, and even he could hear how quiet his voice had become, like pushing too hard now would break whatever fragile space had formed between them. Ava didn't respond immediately, her gaze dropping to the table for the first time since they met, not out of dismissal, but something closer to hesitation, and that alone felt like a shift big enough to notice, because a woman who had walked into this dinner with complete certainty was now sitting in silence, thinking. The low buzz of the restaurant returned around them, a waiter refilling water glasses nearby, a couple at the next table laughing too loudly, but at their table, everything felt slowed down, as if time had narrowed to just this moment and whatever came next. Ava exhaled slowly, then reached for her phone again, not to answer a call this time, but to check something, her expression tightening slightly as she scrolled, and Daniel noticed it immediately, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her posture straightened again, like she was being pulled back into a world that demanded her attention whether she wanted it or not. "I have a board meeting in the morning," she said, almost as if reminding herself, though Daniel hadn't asked, and he nodded, unsure if she was signaling the end of the night or just grounding herself again in something familiar. "Then you should probably go," he replied, keeping his tone neutral, even though a small part of him didn't want this to end yet, not like this, not when it felt like something had just begun to unfold. Ava looked up at that, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in irritation, but in surprise, like she hadn't expected him to be the one to suggest ending it, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the tension shifting again, quieter now, but more complicated. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again, this time longer, more insistent, and when she glanced at the screen, something in her expression changed, not dramatic, but enough for Daniel to catch it, a flicker of concern that didn't match her usual control. She hesitated, just for a moment, then stood up slightly from her chair, turning her body away as she answered, her voice lower this time, more private, but not private enough to hide the edge in it. "What do you mean it's not ready?" she said, and even without hearing the other side, Daniel could tell this wasn't a routine call. Her shoulders tensed, her free hand pressing lightly against the table as if steadying herself, and for the first time, she didn't look like the composed CEO everyone talked about, she looked like someone dealing with something slipping out of control. "No, that's not an option," she added, her voice sharper now, drawing a glance from a nearby table, and Daniel instinctively looked away, giving her space, but his attention stayed with her, noticing the way she paced half a step, then stopped, like she was forcing herself to stay grounded in public. When she ended the call, she didn't sit down right away, her back still partially turned, her breathing just slightly uneven before she composed herself again, smoothing her blazer as if resetting everything back into place. When she finally faced him again, her expression was controlled, but the crack was there now, clearer than before, impossible to fully hide. "I might have to leave," she said, and this time, it wasn't a dismissal, it sounded like a reluctant decision, like something she didn't want to do but had no choice about, and Daniel nodded slowly, though something in his chest tightened unexpectedly, not because she was leaving, but because he suddenly understood that whatever was pulling her away right now wasn't just work, it was pressure, expectations. Something heavier than she let people see, and as she reached for her bag, hesitating just slightly before picking it up, Daniel realized that this moment mattered more than either of them had planned, because if she walked out now, things might go back to the way they were before, simple, distant, defined, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain yet, he didn't want that to happen. "Wait," Daniel said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. As Ava's hand tightened slightly around her bag, and for a brief second, she froze, not fully turning back, but not walking away either, and that hesitation was enough for him to stand up from his chair, the legs scraping lightly against the floor, drawing a few glances from nearby tables that he didn't notice. What he did notice was the way her shoulders stiffened, like she was bracing for something she didn't want to deal with right now. "You don't have to pretend it's nothing," he added, his voice lower now, steadier, and that made her finally turn, her eyes meeting his again, sharper than before but carrying something else underneath, fatigue, maybe, or the weight of whatever that call had just brought into the room with her. "I'm not pretending," she replied quickly, almost too quickly, and that alone told him she was, because it didn't match the control she had shown all night. She shifted her grip on the bag, adjusting it on her shoulder as if preparing to leave anyway, but she didn't move, not yet, and that pause felt heavier than anything either of them had said so far. "Then why did you hesitate?" Daniel asked, not pushing, just stating what he had seen, and that landed harder than a direct accusation would have, because Ava's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she looked away, her jaw tightening slightly as if she was deciding whether to shut this down or let it continue. A glass shattered somewhere near the bar, the sharp sound cutting through the room and pulling everyone's attention for a split second, and in that interruption, Ava exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders dropping just enough to reveal what had been hiding underneath all along, not weakness, but strain, the kind that builds quietly over time until it has nowhere left to go. "They're pulling the funding," she said finally, her voice lower now, more controlled but stripped of its earlier distance, and Daniel blinked, the word settling in as more than just a business problem, because the way she said it carried something personal, something tied to more than numbers or strategy. Tomorrow's meeting isn't about growth, she continued, her eyes drifting past him again, unfocused for a second, it's about whether the company survives the quarter. The admission hung between them, heavier than anything that had come before, and for the first time, Daniel understood the rule she had mentioned earlier, the one about things not lasting. It wasn't just about relationships, it was about everything in her life, built under pressure, constantly at risk of collapsing if she let even one thing slip. He took a step closer, not too close, just enough to keep her from retreating back into that distance she used so easily, and said quietly, so you control everything you can, so nothing catches you off guard, and Ava let out a small, humorless breath, something between a laugh and an exhale, because that was exactly it, and hearing it out loud made it impossible to deny. Control is the only reason I'm still standing, she said, meeting his eyes again, and this time there was no mask, no performance, just honesty, raw and unfiltered in a way that didn't match the woman who had dismissed him less than an hour ago. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the noise of the restaurant filling the space around them while something quieter, more real settled between them. Then why stay tonight, he asked softly, and that question landed differently, not as a challenge, but as something closer to concern, because she could have left at any moment, could have walked away the second things became inconvenient, and yet she hadn't, not completely. Ava hesitated again, her fingers tightening slightly against the strap of her bag as she searched for an answer she didn't seem to have ready, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been all night. I don't know, she admitted, and that was the truth, not calculated, not controlled, and for the first time since they met, Ava Carter looked like someone standing in a moment she couldn't fully manage, caught between leaving and staying, between control and something else she didn't quite understand yet, and that uncertainty lingered as she stood there, not moving, as if the next decision she made would matter more than she was ready to admit. You should go, Daniel said, even though every part of him resisted saying it, because the way she stood there, caught between leaving and staying, felt like the most honest version of her he had seen all night, and he didn't want to be the reason she chose wrong. Ava looked at him, really looked this time. Like she was trying to understand why he would say that after everything, and for a second, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again, replaced by something tighter, heavier, building quietly beneath the surface. You don't get it, she said, her voice lower now, not sharp, but strained, and that was new, because Ava Carter didn't sound strained, she sounded certain, always, but that certainty was slipping, piece by piece, and Daniel could see it happening in real time. Then help me understand, he replied, not stepping back, not pushing forward, just holding the space steady, and something in that steadiness seemed to break whatever control she had been holding on to, because Ava let out a breath that wasn't controlled anymore, wasn't measured, it was uneven, like she had been holding it in for too long. She shook her head slightly, looking away, her hand coming up to press briefly against her forehead before dropping again, and when she spoke, her voice carried something raw for the first time. If I leave now, I go back to pretending I have everything handled, she said, her words faster now, less filtered, and if I stay, she stopped herself, like finishing that sentence would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to face, and Daniel felt his chest tighten, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. A chair scraped loudly behind them as someone stood up, the sudden movement snapping the moment just enough for Ava to blink, like she was trying to pull herself back together, but it didn't fully work this time. Her composure didn't return the way it had before, and that was when it happened, the shift from control to something else entirely. I don't have room to feel anything right now, she said, her voice breaking just slightly on the last word, and she let out a short, frustrated breath, shaking her head again like she was annoyed at herself for even saying that out loud, but it was too late, because the truth was already there between them, exposed in a way she couldn't take back. Daniel stepped closer without thinking, not enough to invade her space, but enough to be there, present, steady, and when she looked up at him again, her eyes were different, not distant, not controlled, but overwhelmed in a way that didn't match the image she had built around herself. You think I don't want things to last, she continued, her voice quieter now but heavier, I just don't trust that they do, and that was it, the core of everything she had been holding on to, the reason behind every rule, every decision, every wall she built so carefully, and saying it out loud seemed to hit her harder than anything else had tonight. Her hand tightened against the strap of her bag, her breathing uneven again as she looked away, blinking once, then twice, like she was trying to stop something she couldn't fully control anymore, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost unsteady. "Because every time I do," she trailed off, her words catching, and this time she didn't finish the sentence at all, because she didn't need to. The emotion behind it was already clear, already breaking through the surface she had tried so hard to maintain, and for the first time since they met, Ava Carter wasn't the cold, untouchable CEO anymore. She was just someone standing in the middle of a crowded restaurant, losing control of a feeling she had spent years trying to avoid, and Daniel realized, right then, that whatever happened next wasn't about convincing her to stay or letting her go, it was about whether she would finally allow herself to feel something she had been running from all along. "Ava," Daniel said softly, and her name landed differently now, not like a formal address but something closer, something real, and it made her finally look at him again even as her vision blurred slightly, the pressure she had been holding in all night pushing dangerously close to the surface. She let out a shaky breath, turning slightly away as if that would help her regain control, but it didn't, because once the crack had formed, it refused to close the same way again. "I can't do this here," she murmured, her voice uneven now, almost lost under the noise of the restaurant, and for the first time, she didn't sound like someone worried about being seen, she sounded like someone overwhelmed by being seen too clearly. Daniel glanced around quickly, noticing the subtle attention from a couple nearby, the way people always sensed when something real was happening, and without overthinking, he reached for his jacket and said, "Come on," not as a command, but an offer, and for a split second. Ava hesitated again, her instincts pulling her in opposite directions, leave, stay, shut down, or follow, and then something inside her gave way just enough for her to nod, almost imperceptibly. They moved quickly, not running, but fast enough to escape the weight of the room, weaving past tables, the host's surprised glance, the cool air hitting them the moment the glass doors swung open onto the street, and everything shifted again as the city noise replaced the contained tension inside, horns in the distance, footsteps on the sidewalk, a gust of wind that made Ava wrap her arms around herself instinctively, like she had just stepped out of something heavier than the night air. She stopped a few feet from the entrance, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she turned slightly away from him, her breathing still uneven, her composure no longer fully recoverable, and Daniel didn't speak right away, giving her space, even though every instinct told him this was the moment that mattered most, the moment where she might shut everything down again if he pushed too hard or disappear if he said nothing at all. A car passed too fast, the rush of wind brushing past them, and Ava closed her eyes for a second, her hand coming up to press against her lips as if holding something in, but it didn't work, because when she lowered it again, her voice came out softer, fragile in a way that didn't belong to the version of her anyone else saw. "I don't even know why this is affecting me," she admitted, shaking her head slightly, frustration and vulnerability tangled together in her tone, and Daniel took a small step closer, not touching her, just there, steady, present, like he had been all night. "Because you didn't plan for it," he said gently, and that hit somewhere deeper than logic, because Ava let out a quiet, broken laugh that didn't last long, her eyes finally meeting his again, and this time, there was no distance left in them, no calculation, just raw, unfiltered emotion she had tried to avoid from the very beginning. "I don't have time to fall apart right now," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to steady it, and Daniel shook his head slightly, his expression calm but firm. "You're not falling apart," he replied, "you're just not controlling it for once, and that difference mattered more than she wanted it to, because Ava's breathing hitched again, her shoulders dropping as if she didn't have the strength to hold them up anymore, and for a moment, she just stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, caught between everything she had built and everything she was starting to feel, and then, without warning, her phone buzzed again in her hand, louder this time in the quiet between them, pulling her back toward the reality she had been trying to outrun for the past hour, and she stared at the screen without answering, her fingers tightening around it as if the decision in front of her wasn't just about the call anymore, but about whether she was about to walk away from something she didn't fully understand yet, or finally turn toward it, even if it meant losing the control she had depended on for so long. "Ava," Daniel said again, softer this time, as the phone kept vibrating in her hand, the sound cutting through the quiet space between them like a countdown she couldn't ignore forever, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at the screen, her chest rising and falling unevenly, caught between the world she had built and the moment unfolding right in front of her. Then, slowly, she turned the phone over, silencing it without answering, and that single action felt heavier than anything she had done all night. "They need you," Daniel said carefully, not as pressure, but as truth, and Ava let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening now, no longer able to hide what had been building inside her for hours. "They always need me," she replied, her voice trembling, and this time, she didn't try to stop it, didn't try to smooth it over or regain control, because something inside her had already crossed the point of holding everything together. A tear slipped down before she could stop it, and she let out a quiet, broken laugh, shaking her head at herself like she didn't recognize this version of who she was becoming. "I told you you're not my type," she said, her voice unsteady, almost breathless, "and now I can't even walk away," and the admission hung between them, raw and undeniable, as more tears followed, her composure finally collapsing in a way she had spent years preventing. Daniel didn't move closer this time. Didn't interrupt, just stayed there, steady, giving her the space to choose, and that was what made the next moment real, because it was entirely hers. Ava wiped at her face quickly, but it didn't matter anymore, the tears kept coming, her breathing uneven as she looked at him like she was standing on the edge of something irreversible, and then, before she could lose the courage, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her voice shaking as she spoke the words she clearly hadn't planned, hadn't prepared, but couldn't hold back anymore. "Marry me," she said, the words breaking slightly in the middle, her eyes locked on his, searching, terrified, honest in a way that stripped away everything else. "I know it doesn't make sense, I know it's too fast, but I can't lose something real just because I'm afraid it won't last," and her voice cracked again as she added, almost pleading now, "I don't want to walk away from you." The city noise seemed to fade around them as the moment settled, fragile and overwhelming, and for the first time since they met, Ava Carter wasn't trying to control the outcome, she was risking it completely, standing there with nothing but truth and fear and hope tangled together in her voice. Daniel stared at her, stunned not by the words themselves, but by everything behind them, the journey from distance to vulnerability compressed into a single moment that felt impossibly real, and slowly, he let out a breath, stepping closer, his expression softening as he reached for her hands, grounding her in something steady. "You don't have to decide everything tonight," he said gently, not rejecting her, but not rushing to match the intensity either, "but you don't have to run from it either," and Ava's grip tightened around his hands, like she needed that anchor, her breathing gradually steadying even as tears still lingered in her eyes. The phone buzzed again in her hand, but this time, she didn't even look at it, because for once, she wasn't choosing control, she was choosing something uncertain, something real. And maybe that was the point, because sometimes, the things we say we don't want are the ones that change us the most, and sometimes, the moment we stop running is the moment everything finally begins. So what would you do if you were in her place? Walk away to stay safe, or risk everything for something real? If this story made you feel something, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more stories that might just feel a little too real.